Hi everybody, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the morning. So Andy Hoofnagle, he's a clinician scientist here at the University of Washington. His background, his PhD is actually in mass spectrometry and biochemistry. But then, of course, he went on and did a medical degree, and then trained as a pathologist, and then also became a clinical chemist. And right here he runs. He's the director of the clinical mass spectrometry here at the University of Washington. And I think one of the things that's kind of really exciting about what Andy has done is he's taken all the stuff that we've been talking about and actually has put it into clinical practice. And he's worked out a lot of the issues and the challenges associated with what it means to actually go and offer a quantitative measurement to physicians, in which they have to use that data to make decisions on the care of their patients. And while a lot of people talk about wanting to do that, Andy's one of the few people who have actually done that. And at the same time, it's also been extremely informative just to have kind of regular meetings. Kind of portions of our lab meet regularly with portions of Andy's lab, and we kind of think kind of carefully about how we can apply some of the things that he's learned in the context of making a rigorous quantitative assay, even to just doing basic science questions. And I think some of those things will kind of come out a little bit more when you hear kind of Lindsay Pino talk a little bit more about some of her graduate research later this week. Anyway, I think what Andy's talking about today, we've touched on the topic a little bit of calibration and why it's hard and the challenges associated with it, and that there may not be too many absolutes in quantitation. I think Andy will get through this a lot more about what the challenges are, but at the same time also be positive about what can be done. And so anyway, Andy.
I think that's fair. Thanks, Mike. So this morning I'm talking about calibration, and this afternoon I'm going to talk about plasma proteomics. And so some of these concepts are kind of intertwined, and so it will, but I think it'll all work out. To start with calibration, exactly what Mike said, the purpose of calibration is to turn an assay signal into a concentration. Right? That's first principles of calibration. But what I'm trying to convince you over the next hour, or a little bit more than an hour, is that calibration in basic science can actually help us get more reproducible assays. That's really what this is all about. How to reduce day-to-day variability and to reduce lab-to-lab variability. So that's what I want to talk about for the next hour or so, and I have some vignettes that will hopefully get us through. If this clicker is not working, I'm going to stop using it. So, wait, what? Oh, is there a power button? This is the musical interlude?
This is.
Sorry about that. Just make sure we've got. So you're saying there's a power button? It should be. Sorry. We can use it. It's okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a project, or a couple of projects that we've been doing in HDL proteomics. So let me explain why we're doing this project, and then dive down into what the data showed us. So I put up this slide just to remind everybody knows we're supposed to take our statins to bring our LDL cholesterol down, but what this slide shows in the Framingham study a long time ago is that no matter how good you are at getting your LDL cholesterol down, if your HDL cholesterol is low, you're actually at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And it's data like this and many other studies that demonstrate that HDL cholesterol as a biomarker is actually a protective risk factor for atherosclerosis. But it's probably not cholesterol that's the good cholesterol, but it's actually the proteins that are part of the HDL particle that are doing the good business, and the HDL cholesterol is just a marker of those good protein complexes that are in our serum and plasma. So what does HDL do? It actually takes lipids from lipid-laden macrophages, assembles it up into a package, and takes it back to the liver for excretion out of the body. So we can actually remove cholesterol from fatty streaks and atherosclerotic plaques, the early atherosclerotic plaques that we all have in this room. There's different proteins within HDL that can prevent the degranulation of neutrophils. If you just take ApoA1 or HDL and incubate it with neutrophils and then cross-link the Fc gamma receptors, you can prevent the degranulation. There are proteins in HDL that can prevent the fixation of complement, and so in general, HDL has also been called anti-inflammatory. So that's another hypothesis as to why HDL cholesterol is a marker of protection. And then there's lots of oxidative processes in blood. This is showing lipid peroxides, and there are different proteins within HDL that can actually remove some of these lipid peroxides from LDL, which again are some of the scariest molecules in plasma with respect to the generation of atherosclerotic plaques. So we really wanted to understand more about what the proteins are in HDL. This is a bit of a discovery experiment to start out with, because it wasn't really clearly identified what proteins were in HDL to then guess at what their activities or their functions were. So the experiment that we did was set up like this. Using density gradient ultracentrifugation, you can actually tease apart the bands of the LDL from the HDL. You can use a tube cutter to cut out just the HDL fraction, and using the HDL fraction alone, we can digest it into peptides. I'm not going to go into great detail about how we did the digestion here, but I will later talk about how tricky the digestion can be. And using just standard shotgun proteomics, this is data-dependent acquisition many years ago now. And what we found was that, yes, all the proteins that we expected to see from lipid metabolism were there, including all of the apolipoproteins and some of the other proteins that are similar, and we knew were in HDL to begin with. There are a lot of other proteins that we found, including complement proteins themselves, complement regulatory proteins, as well as acute phase reactants and protease inhibitors. And so when we started to think about what this actually meant, you could think about HDL preventing bad outcomes in cardiovascular disease. These protease inhibitors. Proteolysis is important in weakening the fibrous cap of the atherosclerotic plaque, which can then lead to rupture. And then we have the thrombosis, the development of a clot that actually is what ends up clogging the artery and preventing blood flow to the heart and leading to the infarction of the myocardium and potentially death. And so thinking about regulating complement, and complement actually is important for part of this coagulation cascade, limiting complement activity and limiting proteolysis may be protective in the acute coronary syndrome. So again, proteomics leading to some great hypotheses about why HDL cholesterol is a biomarker of protection. But, so even though we did this shotgun experiment, the question was, if we really wanted to roll this kind of study out in large numbers, how are we going to do this? What's the best way to do this in a precise fashion? And so to start looking at what kinds of proteomic methods we had at our disposal and which ones we wanted to use, we started by just looking and comparing proteomic methods in a clinical study. So this is 30 males that participated in a clinical trial here in Seattle a long time ago. It was called the EGG study, and I say that they're normal people, but this clinical study was to eat 4 scrambled eggs a day for a month. And then the next month they washed out and they didn't eat scrambled eggs. The next month then they had 2 egg beaters and 2 scrambled eggs a day for a whole month. And then, that's gross, and then they skipped a month and they did 4 egg beaters. So they ate basically 4 scrambled eggs a day for 3 months, which I think is horrific, but that's normal. And that study actually has nothing to do with this, with the data that I'm going to explain. I just wanted to tell you that story. So what we did, we used these normal people, we purified the HDL from all of them, and then we did the digestion, and then we used the digests in a number of different ways to try to quantify the protein. So using shotgun proteomics, just back in the day, is an Orbitrap. So we were going to do both the spectral counting as well as extracted ion chromatograms. So this is looking at the intact peptide with high resolution. And then we had a triple quad where we could look at MRMs from the specific peptides. We could use isotope-labeled peptides as an internal standard, or we could use isotope-labeled ApoA1. So this is an N15-labeled ApoA1, which is now available commercially, that we could spike in and use that one protein as an internal standard for all. And the reason that we're comparing these two is because this is expensive. Each of these internal standard peptides is hundreds of dollars, whereas if we can find a single protein, and if this approach works, we could use a single protein and potentially save money, yet be able to do many, many samples reliably. So what the questions that we wanted to ask are, how do these different approaches to quantify proteins, how do they compare with current immunoassays that are available, and are they reproducible, and are they linear? So the first thing that we looked at was spectral counting. So on the y-axis in the next few slides are the results from a different biochemical approach, an immunoassay, for each of these 6 proteins. So these are, they're all called apolipoproteins. This is also called clusterin, which is a regulator of complement. So when you look, I don't know, that doesn't look so good. It's not horrible, but it's I guess it's horrible. Some of them are horrible. So we thought, spectral counting, there's some variability, there's some of that, there's some stochastic processes about select the peptide or not select the peptide for doing an MSMS. So we thought maybe spectral counting would be not quite as good as extracted ion chromatograms, where we're really looking at all of the MS1 data in an unbiased fashion. It really didn't improve things very much. So I love triple quads. That's what we do in the clinical lab for small molecules. We quantify small molecules every day using a triple quad. So we thought just doing an MRM is going to improve things. Well, it did a little bit, but it didn't. Just by looking at the peak area of the MRM, things are not, they're improved, but they're not fantastic. What we found was that when we added internal standard peptides, we started to remove some of those sample-specific matrix effects by having the internal standard, and we improved the correlation between the biochemical measurement by immunoassay and the results that we were getting from mass spectrometry, which was pretty cool. What we then did, and again, because this is now 2 peptides for each of these proteins, so 6 times 2 is 12, and they're quite a couple of $100s a piece, sometimes up to $500 or $600 a piece, depending on how good your internal standards are. So you can see that this quickly gets expensive. So by using this apolipoprotein A1 as an internal standard and using peptides to normalize the peptides from each of these proteins, if you look, they're actually pretty similar in that the ApoA1, the assay gets significantly better, the top left-hand corner. The rest of them look about the same. And so we're able to use the internal standard peptides from this one protein to improve the correlation of the mass spec data with the biochemical immunoassay, which was a pretty encouraging first step for us. So then we wanted to figure out what is the variability. So this is the kind of experiment that we decided to do. We took control HDL, we digested it 12 times, pooled them all together, and injected that many times over many days. We then took 5 digests that we didn't pool and injected each of those 5 digests 4 times. So over here we can get a sense of what is the variability of the mass spectrometric part, the LCMS part, and this over here we can get a sense of what is the variability of the digestion part. And when we broke all of this out, there's lots of data here. So the first column is what is the correlation with the immunoassay. I'm going to show you data to explain the linearity in just a moment. But if you look for each one of this, taking ApoA1 as an example, this is the protein where we have an internal standard protein. It's exactly the same protein. You can see that using the internal standard peptide, the LCMS is low, the digest is higher. We can reduce that digestion variability significantly. Over here, the LCMS looks pretty good for the other proteins. It goes up a little bit because we don't have exactly the chemically identical internal standard that's luting at exactly the same time that the imprecision goes up a little bit. But overall, and this is a total imprecision calculated by ANOVA, the IS approach, in other words, using that single internal standard protein, is behaving and performing from a precision perspective just as well as the internal standard peptides, which is more expensive. So linearity and precision are 2 of the most important things in a biomarker in the clinical laboratory. If a doubling of the concentration gives us a doubling of the signal, we feel good about that. In addition, if we're very precise and we can get the same answer for the patient every day, that's also the hallmarks of a good clinical assay. So the linearity experiment here was to dilute human HDL with mouse HDL. And we would expect to not see any of the signal from the mice, which we've demonstrated for these 12 peptides, and we can see that all of these measurements are linear. So now we have a precise and a linear method, either with internal standard peptides or with a single internal standard protein. Removing the digestion variability using the protein, removing the LCMS matrix effects by using the internal standard peptides. Any questions about that? So we feel very strongly about triple quad. measurements of proteins. That's what we do in my lab clinically. But we've also demonstrated that PRM is another very good method for getting good data. Please, question.
So, but you of course also digested your protein, your internal protein to make peptides. And you have, how did you define the correction factor? Is it then the median or the average of all the peptides on that protein?
We selected a single peptide for each peptide. So either they eluded chromatographically close, and it turns out there's actually two peptides that if you use either one of them for any of these peptides, you get good data. So I think it's peptide specific, and you need to look at the precision as you're developing the assay.
I can follow up as when we've done this before. What we've done is basically normalize the signal intensity to all of the ApoA1 peptides and chose the one that gave us the lowest CV in general.
So that's basically what we do as we're developing these assays. So you have 10 peptides from ApoA1. You can reliably see 7 or 8 depending on your instrument. So taking all of those 7 peptides and taking your data across a data set and saying which one reduces the variability from the digestion or from the chromatography the most, and using that peptide as the internal standard.
But I think there's another little bit of confusion here is you're not calibrating this to your ApoA1.
Not at all.
This is just a way to minimize the variance from your injections.
No, listen, I got, but that means that different peptides can be normalized with different ApoA1 peptides.
Absolutely.
You always take that peptide that gives you the lowest CV based on replicates that you have.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but also, so something else that we do that I haven't talked about here, and I think I'll be able to talk about later today, is the concept that peptides, if you're going to try to quantify the concentration of a protein and you're not looking for post-translational modifications, then peptides should correlate with one another. So using different internal standard peptides, both precision as well as peptide-peptide correlations are the two things that we use to decide what internal standard to use.
Did you check which of the ApoA1 peptides is used then most frequently?
The VQPY peptide is the one that we use most frequently.
And what are we talking? Is it like used in 99% of the cases always the best, or is it more like retention time dependent and they have certain retention times one peptide is used than others?
I hate to say it, but it's peptide dependent. And there are some peptides for which ApoA1 internal standard didn't improve the CV. So we just finished a study that was 900 samples for this experiment. And we had, instead of 38 peptides, instead of 6 proteins, we had 38 proteins. And out of those 38 proteins, probably 90% of them used the VQPY peptide. A couple of the others used the DLAT and the DYVS peptide. And then there were 2 peptides that the peak area was actually better than any internal standard corrected. So it was very peptide dependent. It had nothing to do with the retention time, but it was all about what Mike was just saying, reducing that variability and looking for peptide-peptide correlation. Does that help? Yeah.
I'll just quickly interject that also we put support for this in the Skyline. There's something called an explicit standard. We played with global standards here. There's an explicit global standard also.
Is saying that you could use a peptide for all peptides, or you can say this peptide goes to this.
If you use the global standards as we've done with this in this class, then you would get a single peptide or a set of peptides for all peptides. But you can also do this one-to-one assignment that you're describing. You could either use no standard, or you could use a standard and single peptide.
And Clark did use Skyline to do all of the 900 samples. I will say that, and so it does work. Just so you guys know, the reason you're here is well worth it. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, so I wanted to talk. I'm not going to go through all of these steps. I know that you guys are talking about selecting peptides. Again, I will throw out the plug in case it hasn't been discussed overtly. Make sure that your peptides are stable, because that will bite you in the ass. We have spent thousands of dollars making antibodies to specific peptides that turn out not to be as stable as we thought they were. So beat your peptides up and make sure they're stable. And in addition, peptides, if you really want the protein concentration, make sure you find peptides that correlate with one another across the sample set that you think you're going to be measuring. Because that correlation is indicating that they're being digested well, that they're flying well, and that they're truly representative of the protein concentration. So just something to keep in mind. So there's lots of ways that we can digest, and I'm going to go into a couple of examples. We have to pick our calibration system. Again, how we're going to turn the signal into a concentration. What internal standards are we going to use? In the clinical lab, we're really using isotope labeled internal standard peptides or winged peptides. How are you going to build your quality control? So, Mike touched on this, we're not using internal standards to calibrate. There are going to be examples of that in the future, but we're not doing that right now. We're calibrating using external calibrators, so I'll go into more detail about that. So we're not using an internal standard as a calibrator, and we're not using our calibrators as QC materials. If you have a quality control material in your assay, you use the calibration to define what the concentration is in your QC material. This is how you're monitoring the quality of your assay. So don't use your calibrators as your QC materials, please. And then I'm going to talk more about interlab comparisons at the very end, and so that you can see how calibration can really improve assays as they get deployed around the world. So for internal standards, I'm defining the peak area ratio as the endogenous divided by the internal standard. This is very standard, and again, we have separate internal standards for each of the peptides in the experiments that I'm going to talk about here. This is a paper that was published almost 10 years ago. This was setting the stage for how good we were at doing proteomics, and it was really asking the question, what is the interlaboratory variability of these experiments? I'm going to skip experiment number 2 or B and just talk about these two, which I'll call 1 and 3 in the next couple of slides. So in this experiment, all that was done was they mixed 11 non-labeled peptides with 11 internal standard peptides, spiked that into a digested pooled plasma, made samples at different concentrations and sent them to each of the laboratories and said, can you get the same peak area ratio? That's all they're asking, right? These are the same, they're exactly the same ratio. Can you get the same amount? In this experiment, NIST actually put together some samples in their own laboratory where they took target proteins and spiked them into plasma, and then they sent out these 9 samples to, again, all of the labs. These are the CPTAC consortium, and asked, if you do the reduction, the alkylation, the trypsin digestion locally, then tell us, and then spike in your internal standard peptides, tell us how good you are as a consortium at getting precise measurements. So again, this was state of the art back then. I think things have improved as I'll show you. But just asking the question from study number 1, what was the variability? And this is at 46 nanomolar and 2.9 nanomolar. This is supposed to be near the limit of detection. This is simply asking what is the variability between laboratories of a peak area ratio. Right? Just take the sample and inject it on your mass spectrometer. I never expected to see CVs as high as 13.7%. I didn't expect that. And as you can see, it's not very different between the 2 different concentrations. The way that they then analyzed experiment number 3 in the paper was to say, if we digest everything in triplicate in our laboratory, and then we inject it 4 times, and then we take that average and compare it to other laboratories. So that's a lot of replicates, right? They're averaging 12 replicates for each of these. Look at the CVs of these. This is a CV of 32.2%, which means the 95% confidence interval actually crosses 0. So this is basically saying that the state of the art 10 years ago was pretty bad, and that we're not able to get reproducible measurements between laboratories. If I do it like I would actually do it in the clinical lab, 1 digest and 1 injection, none of these assays actually were less than 15%, and getting anywhere near the limit of detection was pretty bad. So these data really said 10 years ago we were not in a good place. And part of the reason is, first of all, LC-MS instruments are actually variable between each other. We have to keep in mind that there are interferences, and we have to think about that as we're developing our assay. The other problem is digestion. So think about all the steps. So we have to denature our protein, whether we use urea, Rapigest, or PPS, which are commercially available. Denaturing agents, TFE, which is a very powerful dehydrating solvent and really unfolds things extremely efficiently. Lots of people use acetonitrile, a little more gentle than TFE, but can help with trypsin. Remember that trypsin is active in very significant concentrations of acetonitrile. So after denaturing things, we're going to reduce. Are we going to use DTT? Are we going to use TSEP? There are some arguments out there that you don't even need to reduce. If you don't have a reduction alkylation step and you know the peptides don't have any cysteines and you know that they're freely liberated, you can skip these 2 steps perhaps. So people are starting to experiment with that. Are we going to use iodoacetamide or something else, and then are we going to quench? If you have lots of extra iodoacetamide around that you don't quench, sometimes that can lead to post-digest modifications of peptides. So what are you going to do about that? Are you going to use lyc before trypsin? How much trypsin are you going to add? Are you going to buy the expensive stuff, which is about $6 a sample? Or are you going to buy the cheap stuff, which you can actually get away with 30, 40 cents a sample? So all of these things have lots to do with, I'll show you what pH are you at. I'm going to show you some experiments about mixing and whether or not mixing has any effect on the quality of proteolysis, and then the length of incubation. I think as we're learning, Chris Shuford published one of the more important papers in MCP about this, that the longer you incubate, the more your peptides that you think you're making, you're actually degrading. So those overnight digestions that everybody does, be careful, because your peptides will actually start to disappear, and I'll show you some examples of that. So, the first thing, denature. So, TFE is, you don't have to add very, you can add 50% TFE, then dilute it down to 5% and do your trypsin digestion. Urea, you can denature your proteins in 6 to 8 molar and then dilute that out to 1.6 molar or less and get good digestion. So when we look at these two different peptides from ApoA1, depending on how we did the denaturing step, again, everything after denaturation was exactly the same, you can get very different responses. And this is now endogenous peak area divided by the internal standard peak area, which is then normalized to the protein concentration for other reasons. You can see that you get very different results. Oh, and it's also true for other peptides, and this is apolipoprotein B, which I'll talk more about in just a second. So, depending on your denaturant, you may get very different results. This was one of this is one of my favorite experiments. This was an accident. So, you set your thermomixer to 999 and walk away, and it's supposed to mix all night long. But what happened was Jess came into the lab and it had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure when, but she decided to take finish the experiment. She set it up the next night and said, okay, well, I'm going to do my thermomixer, and then we started talking. We're like, well, why don't you try this experiment end over end, because we have that little rotator that you can put into the 37-degree oven and have it rotate end over end. So she did all three of these experiments. And what we're looking at here for apolipoprotein A1 is the correlation from peptide 1 and peptide 2. This is actually the response. So this is divided by the internal standards, the same as batch of internal standards throughout here. And what you can see is that even the thermomixer running properly versus end over end, we actually get a different relationship of these peptides to one another, which isn't expected. So either we're liberating this peptide more effectively, peptide 1 more effectively, when we do it end over end, or something else is happening. Oh, but when you stop shaking, you actually get more of each peptide. It gets back to that degradation of peptides that I mentioned briefly. So, just mixing, and whether or not you mixed for all 16 hours, or if it only mixed for part of the 16 hours, we get slightly different results. Well, this is one protein. Here's the shocking data, though. Here's a different protein. So depending on how we mix, all of them were 16 hours. Just depending on how we mix, we got very different responses between peptide 1 and peptide 2. This is a different protein, A plus C3. That's scary, because again, we want to take this signal and equate this with a concentration one day. So we have to be really careful about what the mixing is. I mentioned that peptides can disappear. Here's some of the first data that we published looking at, whoa, here comes the peptide, and there goes the peptide. It does flatten out after 16 to 18 hours, but not for this peptide or those peptides over there. So depending on when you stop your digestion, you may or may not have all of the peptide you thought you would have. And so we have to think about how long we're going to digest. And this, by the way, the curves are completely dependent on how much and how good your trypsin is. We then wanted to ask the question of, well, what happens if somebody accidentally pipettes 10% too much trypsin or 20% too much trypsin? Is that going to screw us up? So we're looking at 12 different peptides from a number of different proteins. The middle dot in each of these is actually the correct amount of trypsin. The left dot is half as much, and the right dot is twice as much trypsin as we're supposed to add. And so what you can see is that some peptides, if you add too much trypsin, you get more peptide. But in some of the other peptides, if you add too much trypsin, you actually get less. So even the amount of trypsin can have big effects on how much peak area you get for your tryptic peptides. Any questions about that? So, be careful with your digestion. question, validate it, and try to figure out where those steps that if somebody messes it up just a little bit, how much it's going to mess up your experiment. So that you can remind people as they're going through their standard operating procedure, hey, don't screw this step up, and here's why. Okay, please.
Your recommendation. I mean, I guess not everybody it's impossible for every target to do all these tests that be done. Is that something like an optimal suggestion that we have?
We have, sadly, we have a couple of different digestion protocols that we use in our lab because it's black magic and people get into their groove and they find what they like. And what we have found is once people develop a method, so we developed a method for blood spots, we developed a method for plasma, we have a method for HDL, and as long as people do it the same way every time, we get pretty good results. For what we're doing now for thyroglobulin includes deoxycholate, which is one of the clinical assays that we have. The other is retinol binding protein, which is a high abundance protein or higher abundance protein, and we're doing a TFE for that. And so I think it's protein dependent and it's workflow dependent. It's very difficult to take a TFE, which is by far and away for us the most robust digestion conditions. It's hard to take a TFE digest and then use immunoaffinity to enrich the peptide. So we had to switch the denaturing conditions to be able to do that. So it is situation dependent, but for complex mixtures, we have had such amazing luck with TFE that we use that for almost everything.
I'll also point out, so Lindsay will be talking about how basically using data independent acquisition, you can evaluate all these things for lots of things in like a day or two of instrument time. So that's a kind of it's kind of changed our perspective on whether or not we should actually be doing all of these things with every new sample we get, and kind of the answer is it's not that onerous. Well, I think she'll say it's probably pretty onerous. But it isn't it's not as bad as what it used to be, where you're had to optimize these things for every individual peptide with one experiment.
I think, yeah, that you can do a matrix of things to try to find your, and I guess that's what I'm saying, is definitely try to stress certain parts of the digest. If you're going to deploy an assay for thousands of samples, stress it. If you're just going to do an experiment for that has 20 or 25 samples, you don't have to worry quite so much about the robustness or the variability of things. But I think for if you're going to try to use that assay over a long period of time, know the weak spots is what I would recommend. Yeah.
Some people are using pressurized system like gyrocycles. Have you used those things?
Pressure, you said?
Yeah.
So the quick answer is no. What I've been fascinated by is if you look at most of the papers, I'm going to use the microwave as the example. I haven't been following the pressure, but the microwave studies are fascinating because they'll take a sample and they'll incubate it overnight in their regular digestion conditions, and then they'll incubate it for a short period of time in the microwave and say, wow, the microwave is amazing. But they never compare the short period of time without the microwave. And it turns out if you look at a short period of time, which I'll show you, and you just increase the amount of trypsin, you don't need a microwave. So I think if you beat the proteins over the head with trypsin, you can get away with no pressure and no microwave, but you have to be careful about how long you digest for. I'll explain more about that. So no, we don't use any of the tricks. Some people love them. Again, it's black magic, so you get to pick what you love. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our experiences with trying to calibrate protein assays, and I'm going to talk about bulk plasma proteins here. So we chose to try to quantify apolipoprotein A1 and ApoB because HDL, I already talked about, is the good cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol is the bad cholesterol. And what people have shown is that if you look at, these are two different curves. We're looking at LDL cholesterol versus ApoB. This is the receiver operator characteristic curve, trying to predict bad outcomes in men or women. And showing that if you measure the amount of apolipoprotein B, which is the structural protein for LDL and VLDL, you actually get a better prediction of bad outcomes than you do with LDL in men, and it's even more significant in women. So in other words, having lots of that protein, that scaffold protein for LDL, may be a better marker for bad outcomes. And it turns out, not in this paper, but in other papers, that apolipoprotein B divided by apolipoprotein A may be even better than ApoB by itself. So this is kind of a thought slide. How would you calibrate your assay? So internal standard peak area as the denominator, and the endogenous peak area as the numerator, times the concentration of the internal standard is the simplest way. This is easy, right? I know how much I spiked in, and so my internal standard is a known quantity. I just have to compare the two and multiply by the concentration. Lots of people do this. You'll see this in papers every week from MCP. This is standard. People love this. I'm going to talk about some of the assumptions that are associated with each of these and how some of the assumptions break down. So what about external calibration? This is the concept of taking a spike matrix. Lots of examples. We could take prostate-specific antigen or PSA and spike it in the female plasma, which has no PSA. Use that as a calibrator, so different concentrations of PSA. Or we could take thyroglobulin, which we can purify from human cadaveric thyroid glands, and spike that into bovine serum. Again, different concentrations of thyroglobulin. So you can think about lots of different ways that we could make calibrators, build a calibration curve, and then turn the unknown peak area ratio into a concentration. Or this other way, which is, I call it a single-point calibrator approach. This is where we take something native, a native human sample. Again, I'm talking about plasma here. So what if we just took native human sample, we digest it in triplicate, and then use that as our one calibrator, using the average of the triplicate. So that would just be a native human plasma sample. Something else that we've used in our lab and still use is taking a native human sample and dilute that into a separate matrix. For instance, fish serum, chicken serum, bovine serum, things like that. So native human spiked purified proteins for the internal standard. That's what I'd like to talk about over the next couple of slides. So first, let's use internal standard. So we've already talked about peptides versus proteins, and again, a simple ratio. Sorry, this is a sorry, that's a repetitive. Let me skip that slide. What are the assumptions about just taking the endogenous to the internal standard peak area? Again, another thought slide. Just think about it for a second and then read these. First, the digestion has to be complete. If you're going to say that the endogenous peak area is representative of the protein concentration, you have to have all of the peptides liberated from the protein. If you don't, you're not getting the right answer. Next, you have to assume that the response ratio, in other words, the endogenous peak area divided by the internal standard, is going to be constant from digestion to digestion. Right? Every day I have to get the same answer. And then finally, if it's really going to be as simple as the ratio, that means that the endogenous peak area divided by the internal standard has to be a linear thing, has to be a linear response. So all of those three assumptions are important if you actually want to make this calculation mean anything. So again, it's just as simple as taking the peak area divided by the peak area. There's nothing more complicated than that. By the way, which peptide are you going to use? So think about that. So, I've already shown you these data, but I want to show it again because we've talked about the peptide has to be completely liberated. It has to be completely digested. And out of all of these peptides, there may be two that fit the bill after 18 hours. The DSAL peptide and the APPP peptide to make the Apolipoprotein A1 to make it B. And so, if we were to pick any other time or any other peptide, we may not have complete liberation of the peptide, or some of it may have disappeared. We already talked about the trypsin. We said we were making the assumption that the digestion is going to complete them, but all I have to do is vary the amount of trypsin just a little bit, and I can get more peptide. In other words, I'm creating something from nothing, perhaps, or I get less. And remember again, I have to pick one of these peptides to call, I'm going to use that divided by the internal standard, and I'm going to claim that I get a concentration, but depending on how I did my digestion, I may or may not get a realistic number. And then again, based on these data, which peptides from ApoC3 would you actually pick? And I'll remind you, when you're doing a ratio of the endogenous to the internal standard, the endogenous peptide, when it gets concentrated enough, it's actually going to bleed into the places to the internal standard channel, and it's going to alter the ratio to be not linear. There are other reasons why it's not linear as well. You can actually assess linearity by plotting on a log-log scale and fitting with a power function. And if you look, this is AX to the N. If N isn't 1, it looks linear. if you run a log-log scale, this is a non-linear response. So these data plotted on a log-log scale look beautiful. That's why we love publishing that way. So these are some data that we've published before. This is looking at diluting a reference material and showing that the relationship is not linear. Again, that exponent is not 1, but in this case, -1. This is some data from Steve Carr's lab, elegantly showing, I love how they plotted it. So here's the expected, and they're showing that the slope is not 1 for either one of these proteins, and this is just spike into a matrix, and showing that this simply isn't linear. Even though when you plot it on the log-log scale, it's linear. It's beautiful, but it's not linear really. So, all of those assumptions, every one of them, is not valid. So the simple ratio of the endogenous to the internal standard is not a way to calibrate an assay, especially, as I'll show, over time. Questions about that? Okay, so let's talk about the external calibration of the spike matrix. We're making some assumptions here that the spike protein, usually we use purified proteins in our lab, but you can also think of getting recombinant proteins. So you have to make the assumption that the spike protein is similar in shape and similar in post-translational modification, which we know recombinant proteins are not. So just think about that. And the reason that this is important is because the digestion of the spike protein has to be similar to the native protein in the native sample. It's got to act the same. And we make another assumption that the relative slopes of the calibration curves are going to be similar from day to day. And this is where things fall apart. So, well, first let me show you what happened. So, we expect the response versus the immunoassay to be similar from day to day. And as I showed you before, on different days, things don't behave the way we would expect. So even in a serum digestion and plasma digest, day 3 is looking very different from day 1 or 2. It follows the protocol, but even day 1 and day 2 are different. So the peptide response from day to day is not actually looking the way it should. So we tried to use this external calibration trick. We can make a calibration curve. So this is apolipoprotein A1 and apolipoprotein B spiked into a non-human serum. We get beautiful curves. They're perfectly linear. But what we found on 2 different days, looking at the recovery, depending on the day, we got very, very different calibration results. In one case, we were 5 times wrong, 5-fold wrong, and the other day we were 2-fold wrong for a different protein. So sometimes you can be close to right, and sometimes you can be super wrong, and this is all because the calibration curves aren't correcting for what we hoped. This is another thing that really scared me about purified protein spiked in. This is thyroglobulin spiked into bovine serum. So on day 1, we got about 12 nanograms per mil. After day 55, we could only find 3 nanograms per mil. Think about that. This is a spiked protein. This is LCMS, so I should be generating peptides. Where did the protein go? We don't know. What we think is that it was folded up into some weird aggregate that we were unable to pull out using urea. Since we've changed to deoxyfolate and other experimental and other trypsin digestion protocols, we haven't seen this kind of loss of spiked protein. We think that's what it is, but this is scary, I have to say. So that's my question for you. If you can think of other things, perhaps over beers tonight, please tell me. And so, again, the assumptions were that the calibration curve would be able to fix that variable response versus concentration curve, but what we demonstrated was that that doesn't always work. And I think it has a lot to do with the digestion protocol itself. I think that there are very good examples, as I'll show you at the end of it, where people are using spiked proteins and they have good luck. But I just want you to be careful. So this is the last example, and this is what I'm going to encourage all of you to do because it's so easy and something that you can do in your research labs. So here what we're going to do is take a human plasma sample, and we're going to arbitrarily assign the concentration of the clinical immunoassay. I don't like immunoassays, I don't think they're right, but I can pick whatever number I want. I could pick 100 just arbitrarily and say, this sample now has 100. And it doesn't matter, because the reason I'm going to use it is to reduce variability, not necessarily get the right answer. I'm going to measure out a triplicate, and I'll use it as a single-point calibrator, and I will say it's cheating, but it might work better than the alternatives, and so we pursued it both clinically as well as in our research program. So for what we did, I showed you, if I take those 3 days worth of data that I showed you before, using the calibration curve, I didn't get good data, but using a single-point calibrator, we were able to shrink those 3 days of data back down to a good relationship between the immunoassay and the LCMS. So using that single-point calibration approach, we were able to reduce day-to-day variability, which is the goal in a lot of the research that we do. So this actually has very reasonable coefficients of variation. Within-day variability of less than 10%, and between-day variability now less than 12%. So we're really at a place where the protein quantification, if we use calibration correctly, between-day can actually be as good as any clinical immunoassay. So, given these data, we then had the hypothesis that we could reduce inter-laboratory variability using a similar approach. So, first, I'm going to talk about the IGF-1 working group, which is in collaboration with the U.S. Anti-Doping Association, a partnership for clean competition. This was state-of-the-art a couple of years ago. This is exactly the same immunoassay run in London versus UCLA. Now, I know that those are two different cities, but using exactly the same immunoassay to measure exactly the same samples, this slope means that on average we're 40% different from one another. And that R-squared basically says they're completely different assays. It's the same FDA-approved immunoassay. State-of-the-art. Scary. What we proposed then was to see if we could do better with LCMS. So IGF-1 is a pretty short protein. It's only 70 amino acids. It's a marker, so when athletes use human growth hormone, it's really hard to find a group human growth hormone because it disappears so fast. But human growth hormone leads to an upregulation of IGF-1, so it's an indirect biomarker of dosing in sports. Clinically, we use IGF-1 in a couple of different endocrine situations, especially treating acromegaly. So what we decided to do was to do a bottom-up assay for IGF-1. It is small enough you can do top-down. We're developing interlaboratory assays to look at top-down approaches as well. But for here, we're going to use an N15 labeled IGF-1. So we add pre-digestion as an internal standard. And then for calibration, we're going to compare single-point calibration with the standard reference material that we could buy from the catalog in Europe. So we're able to compare both the external calibration curve as well as this single-point calibrator. And what I wanted to walk through is what are all the sources of variability when you try to make a calibration curve? Because you're going to want to do this. So where can what is all the variability? So I've grouped together the steps where I think we can see the parts of variability. So first, there's going to be variability in how much protein is in each of the vials that they send us of the standard reference material. And I think that you'll be very surprised if you actually measure how much protein you get when you order a purified protein from the vendors that you will buy them from. They say 100 nanograms on the tube, but that's probably incorrect, just right now. We have to reconstitute the standard reference material, so we have to add some volume and swirl it, and everybody does that a little bit differently. We have to make the calibrators, right? So we have to take out some amount of my standard reference material, put it into the matrix, so there's some pipetting differences. There's the whole digestion process. I've got to put my sample into a vial, I've got to add internal standard and I've got to digest. We know that there's variability in all these steps. And then finally, there's the LCMS. There's both the auto-sampler variability as well as the chromatographic and mass spec variability. So we tried to figure out what is the variability at each one of these steps when using an external calibration curve. The standard, we wrote a very anally retentive standard operating procedure. So depending on whether you're in the US versus Europe, you have different catalog numbers for your low-line tubes in Eppendorf. So we included that so everybody would make sure they bought the right thing. And we even did things like list how you should be pipetting. Reverse pipetting is when you go down past the plunger and suck up too much and then just dispense down to the first stop, so that people would, again, always be doing things exactly the same. We had 5 different labs in 3 different countries. I know that it's small, I'm sorry, but the HPLCs were all different, the mass specs were all different, the columns were all different. Everybody got have to make their own method. You do what you're going to do, okay? Just quantify. All we told them was these are the peptides that you got to quantify. And then you pick even whatever transitions you want. And none of these assays have anything similar whatsoever. What we found, and this is actually kind of similar to that experiment that we did, that the CPTAC consortium did, where we're just looking at peak area ratios. So this hasn't been calibrated, but when we just look at the peak area ratio of the two different peptides, you can see one peptide has much greater variability between the laboratories and the other peptide. When we average them together, we got a pretty precise peak area ratio. This is the kind of experiment that I described. This is one injection of a single digest, and this variability looks pretty good. So this is the between instrument variability between each of the laboratories. So that's pretty good, right? 5 completely different LC-MS systems doing pretty good at the peak area ratio level. So now we want to turn the peak area ratio into a concentration, and we did this 2 different ways. We made a calibrator here at UW and then distributed all the labs around the world, versus having them make their calibrator locally. And as you can see, there's a lot of variability when you have to make your own calibration curve. Even with an anally retentive standard operating procedure, people do things a little bit different. So this perhaps isn't that surprising. What I was surprised by was how significant this increase in variability was when people had to make their own calibration curve. So there's, in this standard reference material, there's actually a package insert that comes with it. And down in the very bottom, they actually tell you how bad they are at getting the right amount of protein into each ampule. So it says the expanded uncertainty is between these 2 numbers that if you back calculate. The CV of how much protein they actually got into each of the vials was 4.5%. That's awesome compared to the vials that you might be getting from Sigma. No offense to Sigma, great company. Okay, so the experiment, so then we wanted to figure out if we have 3 bottles of standard reference material, 1, 2, 3. And if each day we make a calibration curve from each one of those vials. We have vial A, B, and C, and then we make a curve, 1, 2, 3, on each of 3 days. You can see that we have 9 calibration curves made from 3 different vials, multiple different days. So now we can assess the variability of making a calibration curve on 3 different days with respect to each of the vials. And, from this experiment, we then measured 7 different samples each day, and we were able to figure out what is the overall variability, what is the variability of making a curve, because we can remove that day-to-day variability and just ask how much variability is there. We can remove the between vial variability and just look at what is the within vial variability from day to day. We can then figure out, they already told us what the variability was of how much protein is in each vial. So then we can actually ask the question, when you add the 100 microliters and do your little swirly, and then take it out, what is the variability of that process? We can calculate that robustly across this experiment. So what we then did was send out 150 samples to all the laboratories and just ask, what is the average CV on all of these? So there's a different coefficient of variation for each of the samples. If we just take the average, what do we get? We found that was 16%, which was a little higher than we were shooting for, but again, not that bad compared to what the state of the art was from the CPTAC about 7 years ago. So I think we've improved things substantially. We then broke it out, right? We know how much variability there is in the standard reference material. We know how much variability there is in the swirly experiment. There's the swirly step. We know that there's variability in making calibration curves. There's obviously variability in the digestion yield CMS, which we were able to figure out. So if we were to remove all of these steps, we predict that the variability would go down to 12.3%. And so all we did was recalibrate the data using single-point calibration approach and found that the CV went down even more. So we love calibration, and we love calibration because it reduces variability, but the single-point calibrator is something that we can all do very easily, right? You can pick any sample in your lab, put it in the freezer with a bunch of aliquots, and take that out every day. Oh, you have a collaborator who wants to show that their results are the same as yours. Send them that single-point calibrator, and now they can get the same results that you do. That's what this is all about. So we're removing day-to-day variability as well as lab-to-lab variability. So I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes talking about TG, unless there are questions about IGF-1. Okay, so the reason that we decided to deploy an assay for thyroid globulin by mass spec in the first place is because patients were trying to measure thyroid globulin, which is this purple ellipse. And the way that we do that by an immunoassay is we take these paramagnetic beads that are coated and stripped out and we grab onto a capture antibody that has biopsy. And we make a sandwich with thyroid globulin and the reporter. So there's two different epitopes on the thyroid globulin molecule. The reporter assay has some sort of enzyme, whether it's colorimetric or a flash of light. This is a chemiluminescent enzyme in the Beckman assay. So if there's TG around, your capture antibody will link up with your reporter antibody, and you'll get a positive signal. But about 20 to 30% of patients who have thyroid cancer make autoantibodies. And those autoantibodies coat the thyroid globulin. And if you coat and mask all of the epitopes that you would use to make a sandwich, you get a falsely low, but unfortunately a falsely negative in many cases, or in some cases, a falsely low or a negative result. So even though you have thyroid globulin and you have recurrent thyroid cancer and you should be treated, you can't see it because of the autoantibodies coating it. So we get falsely low responses. There are other ways that we can get false positives as well, and we're seeing that a lot these days in this assay, which we've been able to demonstrate with mass spec, but this is really the motivating factor for us. So the workflow that we developed, it was coined cis-kappa by Lee Anderson back in 2004. I call it an immunoaffinity enrichment after trypsin digestion because that's what it is. So if you take your complex matrix, you digest it into peptides, you can put an internal standard peptide into the step or the pre-digestion step. After you've generated all your peptides, you can incubate it with these beads. These are paramagnetic beads that have the anti-peptide antibodies. And we're going to purify the peptide of interest as well as the internal standard. We do get some non-specific peptide findings for beads. Not much we can do about that, but we can separate those out by LCMS. Again, taking the peak area of the endogenous and the peak area of the internal standard as our peak area ratio and then calibrate that. So this is a comparison that we did. We just published this last year. We developed the first TG assay many years ago, which has now been replicated in the four larger reference labs in the country, Mayo Lab, Linearity, not shown here as Quest because for legal reasons they decided not to participate in our experiment. But, so, just like I said before, nothing's the same. So, for pre-digestion steps, because thyroid globulin is this gigantic protein that weighs 330 kilodalton monomers joined together to make a 660 kilodalton protein, it's one of the biggest in the plasma. You can actually try to separate out big proteins from little proteins. So that's what Mayo did. They take ammonium sulfate and precipitate out the big proteins to get rid of the little ones. You can get rid of almost all the albumin out of it, for example. ARUP did a clever trick where we know that there are these autoantibodies that coat our protein in patients that have autoantibodies. Well, what if you made a rabbit an autoantibody and just spiked in the rabbit polyclonal antithyroid globulin antibody and then coated it and then precipitated it with ammonium sulfate? So they took that approach. In other words, if you can't beat them, join them. And they were able to separate out the thyroid globulin along with the antibody as a pre-digestion step. In other words, just cleaning up the sample a little bit. We in LabCorp had no pre-sample tests. I talked about calibrators, so I'm the calibrator for our TG assay. This guy. So we decided how much is in me, and then we use that to calibrate our assay in the clinical lab. BCR 457 is the standard reference material that's available for thyroid globulin. And then there are calibrators that you can just buy from the company and just use that as your calibrator. So nobody's calibrating the same way. These are different antibodies. So CPTAC, I mentioned that before. So NIH actually funded the development of these antibodies that are being used clinically, which is pretty exciting. And we're looking at a specific peptide here. This is an antibody to a different peptide that they made in-house. So these assays, again, are very different. But using those fundamental concepts of external calibration or single-point calibrator, can we get good concordance between the laboratories? This is state of the art. So these are 4 different immunoassays, all run at Mayo. So it's the same samples in the same lab on 4 different instruments. This is an example out here. This is a 5, and this is an 11. So these are very different in terms of calibration. Even though there's a standard reference material available, FDA-approved immunoassays give different results. We've seen that time and time again. So this is mass spec. These are all separate, independently developed assays. Just at first glance, you can see that things are significantly better. ARES is a little bit different. They're doing it differently than they're doing a different peptide than the others are. So you can see calibration helps improve the concordance, and you actually have a little bit of leeway in how you calibrate. But the external calibrator, either being a native human serum calibrator or a spike in this instance, has worked quite well. So I encourage you to think about calibrators carefully, because it can reduce inter-day and interlaboratory variability. So I will say it now, and I'll say it 1,000 times. External calibration is better than internal calibration. Please don't use internal standards as calibrators. It doesn't work. We can reduce the day-to-day, system-to-system, and laboratory-to-laboratory variability, all by doing that simple step of having a sample in the freezer in lots of aliquots and using every single day to normalize your data to, no matter how many proteins you're looking at. That's all I have. Do you guys have any questions? Please. Can I talk about that this afternoon? Do you mind? I have a bunch of slides on what kinds of TC and system suitability we can think about, and whether or not they're really telling us what they want to talk about. So if that's okay. Any others? Yeah. Yes.
You have the sample on the computer and you measure it every day once, and you always calibrate the sample that you run on that day, this sample that you goes on.
Correct.
If you want to determine our concentration, you need to know the concentration in your internal.
That's correct. If you really want to define the exact concentration, you have, so what we did here is we defined me by the immunoassay. So we're traceable back to the immunoassay, which turns out to be the same calibrator that these guys are using in their LCMS. So that's one protein. Now how do you do it for 50 proteins? It's more difficult, and there's 2 ways that have been described and that probably work well. The first is to get purified protein and spike it in. You make a calibration curve in the matrix that you're interested in. You take the slope of that calibration curve and back calculate the amount that was in the original material. That's the process called standard addition. Pretty common, but a fair amount of work, and you have to have the purified protein. You then have to characterize the purified protein and make sure that it's pure.
What you think it is.
It has to be what you think it is. So it's got to be pure, it's got to be similar in post-translational modification, all those things. If you're really trying to go back to an absolute concentration. The other way, which probably won't be quite as accurate, but the more peptides you have per protein is probably better, where you can get AAA, so amino acid analysis on internal standard peptides, unlabeled peptides. Use those spiked unlabeled peptides at varying concentrations into the pre-digestion. Use the that again standard addition of the peptide to figure out how much peptide is in the digest at the end of the digest, and then try to use that again as standard addition to figure out how much protein is there at the beginning. Again, if you pick one peptide, you might be wrong, but if you pick 3 highly correlated peptides, maybe you'll get close to right. Those are the 2 ways that you're going to get closest. So, but how do you characterize the protein you're spiking in? Gel, amino acid analysis, shotgun proteomics to see if there's post-translational modifications and if they look like other purified protein is probably better than recombinant.
I just kind of want to highlight a little bit though, is what I think what Andy's trying to get at is that you're basically always calibrating something to some other assay, to some other way, to some other, which also has its own biases and its own issues. And in the end, a lot of it comes down to we call carbon mass 12 because someone just decided we're going to call carbon 12. And so you could just say that, you know, our carbon 12 could be antiplasma or thyroglobulin, and we're going to call it a given amount. And as long as everybody agrees that antiplasma is that amount, then it really doesn't matter. And so, but people have to agree that that's the amount.
The answer is 14.3. And building on that just a little bit, that's where these standard reference materials come in so handy. So there is actually a standard reference material plasma that you can get from NIST, where they've tried to define the concentration of proteins. Many standard reference materials that are available from WHO, the World Health Organization, are actually defined by running a bunch of different immunoassays, like 12, in many different labs, and then taking the average of all of those, a weighted average, and saying, okay, this is the concentration. Again, is it right? Yes. You can. If
figure it out, and what do you do with symptoms that are not standard? I mean, it's not even plasma. I think that there are some proteins so low valence, lower than in samples in the future.
that's, well,
What do you do with those things?
we don't measure proteins that we can't see, right? If we don't see the protein, we're not going to measure it.
So maybe there is other concentration
But that you can use that as a calibrator, right? So
okay, so then you would need to use another calibrator.
yeah, so if, like for instance, in my plasma, there's going to be a protein that's not in my plasma but is in a diseased sample. So I have to get that diseased sample and use that as a calibrator. If I want to use the single point calibration approach, I have to get a sample that has that protein present, or I can spike something in and try to use that. And again, if it's a purified protein, and depending on your digestion conditions, that can work well, but it doesn't work all the
I
time.
just think it is also something important. Or because the mind
Yeah.
can actually do then look at the things that are in these calibrated samples that you have and compare them.
I think that's a very good point, so thank you for making it. So, yes, if you want to have an absolute concentration, you've got to define the concentration. If you don't care and you're fine having a relative concentration, that's fine too, and that's really great in research and discovery. But yeah, if you want to use a single point calibrator, you got to have the protein. I agree.
Everything comes down to just defining it, right? Because, so you could say that amino acid is what you're going to use to define your amount of your peptide, but that amino acid analysis has its biases and issues and errors associated with it too.
I wish I had time to put together our most recent debacle with that. So I'll leave the institution nameless, but we actually have rolled out our retinol binding protein assay with a reference range that's 26% wrong, because the first amino acid analysis that they gave us was 26% wrong. We subsequently verified that their first amino acid, and they did it in duplicate. I say, can you please run it twice, because I want to make sure that the result. They didn't tell me that they did it on exactly the same day and exactly the same batch. So they were precisely wrong twice on the same day. So it screwed up our reference range, but at the same time, we adjusted people's expectations to the concentration because we thought we were right, but we were in fact wrong because of a vendor. So I will happily discuss vendors over beers, but I won't do it in this context. Even when you think you're doing the right thing, like amino acid analysis, you can get the wrong answer, and it's a significantly wrong answer sometimes.
If you are not using any de-digestion step, how strict do you need to digest the process?
A crap ton. So when we add trypsin to serum now, in all of our digestions of serum, we are adding, it's the third most abundant protein in the sample. We're adding micrograms to micrograms of protein that we're digesting. Sorry, milligrams to milligrams of protein that we're digesting. It is a lot of trypsin. In addition, we're doing a very short digestion. So we've learned that the moment trypsin hits water, it starts to digest itself and starts to do non-specific things like degrade the peptide that you're excited about. Shorter digestions, it's just time. And I'll show you some data later that shows peptides come and peptides go in these very high concentrations of trypsin. But again, if you can dial it in and get the right time point, and you know that there's some leeway on either side so you don't screw anything up, you can get some really robust digestions with very high concentrations of trypsin. You can't afford to do what we did, Promega would bankrupt our lab in a day. That's how much we use. Yeah. But it's not necessary.
And that I actually, my peptide and digestive trypsins, I use lysine.
Yeah, so lysine, sometimes people use that as a first step. Yeah, lysine is good. We've had some luck now with Glu-C. We talked about that.
But lysine is like on the order of like almost 10x more expensive.
It is expensive. Yeah. But Glu-C is less expensive than lysine. There are other examples that you could use. Other.
Trypsin doesn't digest lysine sometimes, so.
The pre-digestion with lysine is probably economically viable, but using lysine in our experiments wouldn't be possible.
Have you tried to use rapid trypsin?
We've used lots of rapid trypsins. I've heard that the one from Perfinity is doing really well these days. The first iteration, the beta stuff that we were testing, wasn't good for serum. It was extremely variable, but I've heard it's better now. But we haven't used it recently. There's also a column that Perfinity, in collaboration with Shimadzu, you can actually pass over a solid phase column and basically inject your peptides right into the mass spec. I've heard good stories about it, but we haven't played with it. So yeah, there's other options out there. But we haven't played with solid phase. Anybody played with solid phase trypsin recently? How do they go?
A fair amount in the past, but it's the one kind of interesting thing about it is that trypsin is actually inhibited by arginine-containing peptides. So basically, as you're digesting your sample, you're generating all these inhibitors for your trypsin, which is why for these really complicated matrices you need so much of it to get. And most people, when they're just getting peptide IDs, they don't really care because they get tons of peptide IDs, even though their digestion's at 60%, 40%. But if you really want to try to extrapolate it back to a protein level, then you really kind of need to make sure that you're getting as good digestion as possible. At least consistent digestion.
And what was your experience?
It was
Not very good. Yeah, okay. And which one were you using?
I don't
No, okay. Yeah, because Sigma had one for a little while, but Perfinity's got a magic sauce, which they claim is. They do? So yeah, literally you mix it in, but it's not dry. Like there's some, even though it looks like it should be solid, dry trypsin, there's something in there that they won't tell me what it is. Coffee time.